How's it going, everyone? Back again here to talk about the categories of flies. And there are 4 basic categories of flies. There are dry flies, wet flies, nymphs, and streamers. So these are kind of the 4 general categories. There are some other categories of flies that we won't talk about here, but I just want to give you a basic primer on some of the categories of flies. And streamers, which we've talked about a little bit with the woolly buggers, are one of the typical categories, and these, although the woolly bugger maybe isn't your perfect streamer pattern, there's one I'll show you here in a second on the other camera that is a good example of one. But they're typically tied on longer shank ties, flies, hooks, and flies. So as I mentioned before, remember the X. So these might be on some of those 2 or 3X long hooks. So they're a little bit longer hook, and they can also be on streamer patterns as steelhead flies can be commonly tied as well. So let me just show you quickly here a couple of, I'll show you a woolly bugger first that's tied. And this is a little Burgundy Leech. And again, you can see the hook that's on that longer shanked hook here. So you have this is probably more of a typical standard streamer hair wing streamer pattern. And you can see it's got these, these wings tied on top. And you can see the profile. This is actually on a steelhead hook. But the profile is just a longer fly. So you can imagine that looks a little bit like a sculpin or some sort of a bait fish, right? You can do all sorts of things. You could put eyes on the front of this. You can, add some more movement on the back. Add some flash, but you can kind of see the difference. So a streamer is basically a pattern usually imitating some sort of another fish or a leech or something long and wiggly. So this is kind of one example of the streamers. So for dry flies, they're a different deal. They typically sit on top of the water, and quickly running through the life cycle of aquatic invertebrates. They are basically reside a good majority of their life on the bottom, living in that part of their life history. And then they hatch out and they're migrating up through the surface. Eventually they get to the top. Well, a good chunk of the bugs do, and they hatch out off the surface. And that's the dry fly when they're actually hatching off the surface. And then you also have the spinners that are coming back for some of the other species that actually come back and lay eggs on the water as well. So you kind of have that part of the life history. Just a quick little primer there, but they come in a wide range of shapes and sizes, and I'll show you a couple here in a minute here. The elk hair caddis is one that's pretty common, and I'll show you here just right now on this angle what elk hair and the difference between this pattern. So you can see that little guy, and it's got that nice fluffy wing. It's got nice dry, stiff hackles, so it's going to float. It's going to land on the surface and just float right on the water. And I can tell you this is a killer pattern. Here's another. This is a little Adams. See that little guy? And all the hackle. That's just basically it's just on a super light wire hook. Just gives you an idea of what you're looking at. You can also have some other dry flies that are a little bit bigger. As you see here, this is a stimulator with some rubber legs. So this is imitates a stonefly. But just another example of a big fly, and you can see lots of the elk hair helps float it. And if you really want some floating, this little hopper is all foam. That's just a big chunk of foam. So of course this thing's going to float like a cork in the stream, even through riffles and stuff like that. So those are 2 of a few of the dry flies there. And so we kind of covered that. So we looked at the streamers, the dry flies, and now for nymphs, again, getting back to that life history, you've got those fish that are on the bottom. So they're crawling around, so they're not going to have any hackle because they haven't hatched out yet with their wings. But they're typically, they might have some legs, they might have weight. They're probably usually tied on a little bit heavier hook. And I'll show you here on this angle. Let's see, did I grab let me grab one right here, just to show you. So there's a lot of different streamers. You can just look at a little, like for example, a little pheasant tail. That's one little guy here. There's also hare's ears. Let me show you just so I can get a good little size for you. This is a little pheasant tail. You can see what this thing has. It's got a bead, gives it some weight. It's got a little bit of flash. It's got some brass wire on the back. And you know, in larger flies with these nymphs, you might even add more weight, wrap some wire around the whole body to add weight. But you can see these things are they're meant to get down to the bottom. There's definitely lots of other nymphs tied on different styles, different colors. You know, here's one that's a little bit larger, similar. You know, I've got a whole bunch of nymphs here, but just gives you an idea that the basic differences, the biggest difference is the nymphs you're getting down to the bottom, and that's where fish are, you know, feeding 90% of their lives. So so that's one really effective way to fish with nymphs, because that's where the fish are usually taking. And you know, depending on the type of fishing you want to do, I definitely love nymph fishing. Some people I think maybe want to do dry fly fishing and stuff like that, but the other type of fishing I really love is fishing wet flies. Wet flies are pretty easy to fish because you're not going to be on the bottom getting snagged up like you might be with nymph fishing. Dry fly fishing can be hard to match the hatch, but with wet flies, and I'll show you again, here's a wet fly. That's a little March brown spider. And again, showing you, thinking of our process of that bug hatching. So down here are the nymphs, if this is the bottom of the stream down here, sitting on the stream. As that bug, as that nymph, as it starts to change and getting ready to hatch out as a dry, it's working its way up the surface, and the current's going this way, pulling it downstream, and this is where fish, and then it's going to eventually get up here and get on the top, and then it's going to hatch out here as the dry. But in this stage, this is where fish will hit the wet fly, and you're going to be swinging it, typically with the wet fly swing, and swing it down, and as it comes down through, this is where those fish are going to hit it. But you can see the little March brown, and again on the hackle, it's got a little bit webbier hackle because you want it to sink. Materials are a little bit made to sink a little bit, so you don't see any of that high floating like you do in the dry flies. You could put a wrap of something to give it some weight, but typically you don't want to get down too far because you want this thing to be typically riding up near the surface film, or just below a little ways. So very, very cool, very effective pattern. I'll show you how to tie that fly and some other ones a little bit later in the course. But there are other categories I won't cover, like I mentioned at the start in this beginner course. These might include, I did show you the hopper, which we're not going to be tying one of those foamers, those foam flies. But bass and panfish flies, saltwater flies, we showed you some hooks earlier, and there's lots of other ones that we won't cover here. But I just want to give you that primer to prepare for the categories and what you're going to be seeing in this one. And we'll show you a number of different patterns, but they can kind of be boiled down into those basics. Again, the four: wet flies, dry flies, streamers, and nymphs. Those are the ones we're going to cover in this course, and that's how we're going to get going. I'll look forward to getting into a little more detail on some of this stuff as we get into it, and I'll see you on the next one.